It's my pleasure to introduce Silvia Polla to give today the keynote speech. Silvia is junior professor for archaeology here at the Freie Universität in Archaeoinformatics. At the Freie Universität. She has a PhD in classical archaeology from the University of Siena, and she will talk to us today about between demography and consumption, digital and quantitative approaches in the Mediterranean surface survey. Just leave it to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you for the introduction. The interpretation of archaeological surface survey data is not straightforward. The recent book by the historian and philologist Leslie Dossey, Peasant and Empire in Christian North Africa, challenged the interpretation of archaeological rural survey evidence in Roman Africa in terms of settlement development, with a refreshing analysis on changing patterns of rural consumption. In recent years, excavation of non-elite settlements have begun to be published, and more significantly, the past quarter century has witnessed several hundred archaeological surveys whose purpose is to reconstruct rural settlement patterns. If no Roman period diagnostic pottery is found at a site, it is labeled unoccupied during this period. Using this technique, survey archaeologists try to determine whether population was rising or falling in certain periods or whether settlement shifted from one ecological niche to another. Nevertheless, as already pointed out by Martin Millet, fluctuations in the supply of pottery can make settlement in certain periods undatable. Millet formulated two conditions that must be satisfied before survey evidence can reflect population patterns. First, the pottery collected must have been supplied at the same rate during the different periods under study. And two, within any particular period and area, all sites must have equal access to the pottery supplied. These conditions are virtually never met if only high diagnostic fineware is collected. Recently, detailed studies of regional courseware and the characterization of regional markets has become a central issue in landscape archaeology. Dossey's analysis of survey evidence as a reflection of rural consumption rather than of settlement dynamics over time links the increasing consumption patterns to the regional development of fineware production in North Africa, permitting capillary inland market penetration. So, considering this premise, in my presentation I will focus on the microregional distribution and consumption patterns of ceramics commodities in the Roman Province Africa Proconsularis, using the surface survey record collected during field work conducted by the University of Trento under the direction of Mariette de Vos in the region of Thugga in northwestern Tunisia. On the one hand, I would like to place this microregional evidence into the context of the debate of the interpretation of survey data in terms of demographic development or changing consumption patterns. By doing so, I will present some methodological approaches for analyzing ceramic assemblages of rural sites and their related interpretative problems. The Roman Province Africa Proconsularis comprised the territory of present-day Tunisia, northeastern Algeria, and western Libya. The economic relevance of the province within the context of long-distance Mediterranean trade connected to the Annona system of supplying Rome and the related distribution of foodstuff and commodities can be shown by the distribution of shipwrecks containing African amphorae in the Western Mediterranean, as well as by the amount of African amphorae and their increasing from the 4th century AD and stabilizing until the 5th century AD and later in significant excavation contexts in Rome. The production geography of the most well-known part of this province, which corresponds to modern Tunisia, shows a distribution of amphorae kilns mainly along the coast and of African reslipware kilns in the hinterland, linked to the economy of agricultural estates. So here the red triangles are ARRS kilns connected to the distribution of olive oil presses installations. African reslipware is a particularly common later Roman fineware produced from the late 1st century AD to approximately the 7th century AD, exported all over the Mediterranean. and strongly related to the economic growth and development of Roman Africa. Here, you can follow the evolution of the state of the art about the distribution of African red slipware in the Mediterranean, from the works of John William Hayes, passing by Tortorella, until the extensive work by Michel Bonifay, who strongly oriented the scholarship to the intra-provincial trade of African commodities. Here, an example of intra-provincial distribution of amphora and of African red slipware, focusing on what David Mattingly defines provincial economies. Regional surveys allow to map distribution and consumption at the microregional scale, considering ceramic assemblages in relation to landscape, topography, and settlement, analyzing the archaeological correlates of the economic structure of the provincial economies. Here, the synthesis of Mattingly's model, where you can see the features linked to the so-called provincial economies, so the local market distribution level of commodities. In contrast to Europe, North African arid clima and traditional agricultural practice have frequently left ancient architectural remains on the surface, so that non-invasive survey provide valuable information about architecture, building materials, irrigation systems, and of course pottery, offering a textbook example of Roman landscape. Survey had a revolutionary role for our understanding of settlement histories and regional trajectories of economic development in North Africa, especially in present Tunisia, where research has been intensive during the 90s, as you can see from the map by David Stone, comparing methods and results of survey project in Tunisia. Today, I will consider the microregion around Thugga. The region lies in the middle Megerda Valley on the southern side of the river, corresponding to the ancient Bagradas River, around Numidian and Roman Thugga, on the Tunisian High Tell. The Megerda Valley has been throughout history a very productive and valuable landscape for agriculture and pasturing, so that the region around Thugga was very densely urbanized in antiquity, and it shows a very dense urban concentration of medium-sized towns, which must reflect intensified agricultural production in the countryside. So here you can see all the sites documented during the survey. In this map you have all typologies and all phases together, giving an idea of the very densely inhabited ancient landscape, and the triangles are medium-sized towns. So it is an example of very dense urbanization in antiquity. The region is also well known because of the 7 so-called Agrarian Inscriptions, which are epigraphic sources spanning the years from Trajan to Septimius Severus' reign, giving us information about the conditions of tenure on the imperial estates in the Bagradas Valley, all located to the west of the probable line of the Fossa Regia. So here, African limes. All these inscriptions concern the bringing of unused land under cultivation. Here you can see the settlement patterns of the region with differentiation of urban centers, villages or nucleated settlement, and farms and or villas, mapped by intensive and extensive survey. So the 2 polygons are intensive respectively and extensive survey. In strong relation to this demographic and economic growth, the survey revealed a landscape of villae and farms continuing until the Byzantine time and maybe later. So it is a very well preserved landscape where it is possible to find as well in situ oil presses installations. So generally speaking, site classification is the vexata quaestio of Roman surface archaeology, dealing with a strong functional and hierarchical landscape. The interpretation of a rural site as a villa or farm or nucleated settlement on the base of the surface material scatters is a very debated issue, as it is strong socioeconomic implications. The typology of agricultural sites documented in Tunisia is very varied, as you can see in this synthesis by Hobson, using the survey evidence from different Tunisian regions where presses installation has been documented, and varied from the villa passing by the fortified farms to small farms without residential part. So it is a problem to define the nature and status of rural settlement only basing on surface information. So using a GIS-based approach, I adopted, in order to approaching this question and to solving this problem, I adopted a methodological framework inspired by Sanders' geographical analysis and similar to the alternative site classification methodology proposed in a recent paper by Witcher, considering factors like longevity and stability of occupation over time, topographic and environmental factors like location and soil quality, and integration to regional road system. So here just an example of longevity of occupation, topographic attributes of sites belonging to certain phase, mapping of soil quality for farms. So these features have been combined, plotted together with quantity and quality of the composition of the ceramic assemblages collected in rural sites, classified as farms or villages. So here you can see the composition, the statistics of the composition of ceramic assemblages in villages and in farms. Here just a list of the ceramic classes, and here the quantification. So considering ceramic classes and mapping their topographic distribution in order to understand better the nature of the rural settlements, I applied a correlation analysis within assemblages between ceramics classes, which can give a picture of the composition of the assemblages and indicate trends of rural consumption among sites, typology, and hierarchy. Changing production distribution and access to commodities produced for trade at different scales. Correlation analysis, which is used to quantify the association between two continuous variables, for example, between an independent and a dependent variable, or between two independent variables, ranges between -1 and +1 and quantifies the direction and strength of the linear association between the two variables. The correlation between two variables can be positive. Higher levels, it means higher levels for one variable are associated with higher levels of the other variable, or negative, when higher levels of one variable are associated with the lower levels of the other. For example, a correlation of 0.9 suggests a strong positive association between two variables, where a correlation of -0.2 suggests a weak negative association. So a correlation close to 0 suggests no linear association between two continuous variables. In practice, meaningful correlations can be as small as 0.4 or -0.4 for positive or negative associations. So here you have an example of these values in connection to the correlation of African red slip ware with other material classes, ceramic classes. So very strong correlation is with, for example, coarse ware, ceramic building materials, and amphora. And this kind of proxy have been used for defining site typology and socioeconomic status using the distribution and correlation of ceramic materials, different productions, wares, and classes in order to understand market integration over time. A similar approach to the analysis of survey assemblages has been adopted recently by Rayala and Mills. Here, mapping wares and vessel function, the mapping of wares and vessel function within the framework of the concept of ceramic scene. This is like the conceptualization of approach to artifact coming from the survey. It is an approach which integrates information from ceramic with landscape elements using a methodology which combines theoretical and methodological approaches from landscape characterization, Roman pottery studies, and archaeological computing. Here, like an interpolated surface, so-called the amphore surface, and here fine ware surface, using a tool for modeling density, a GIS-based tool for modeling density, and interpolating values over space. Combining topographic attributes and archaeological indicators of function and status, like especially presence and absence of certain materials and ceramic classes with the chronology of the sites via multivariate cluster analysis, it is possible to group, it allows to group sites according to the features they share. So it is another approach in order to combine different information obtained by the GIS topographic analysis and from the ceramic based statistic using hierarchical cluster analysis methodology, so like this descriptive statistics. We can obtain the definition of different groups on the basis of the feature these groups are sharing. So here, for example, three groups of farms sharing different features like size, kind of ceramic material, and so on. The archaeological and historical validity and the interpretation of the results remain critical issues, as you can imagine, because we have then to interpret this group and to understand the composition of this group. So it is a main problem of the use of statistics and multivariate statistics in archaeology, the interpretative moment and interpretative phase of the results. But the main problem of survey assemblages is, of course, the reliability of chronology or of chronologies. So here, as an example, coming from this regional survey, you can see the mapping of the phases in the intensively and extensively surveyed microregion. It is attested a gradual demographic growth from the late empire by the diagnostic pottery. In this moment where we have a stronger demographic growth, if we look at the survey remains. The increase in the rural population can be summarized as follows, using the data from diagnostic ceramics collected from 179 sites. 20% of the sites go back to the pre-Roman period, 25% to the early imperial period, 30% go back to the middle imperial period, 50% to the late imperial, 70% to the Vandal rule, and about 70% to the Byzantine period, and 3% to the Islamic period. Following as well new, continuing, reoccupied and abandoned sites trends. The representation of this data and the representation of time and space. Survey results are usually represented within linear time and Cartesian space. According to Wyche's reflection on the use and the interpretation of survey data set, distribution maps reduce the complexity and diversity of sites, representing them as dots, and have the limit of creating ahistorical landscapes, with each period distinct from what came before and uninfluential on what followed. Histograms, on the other hand, concentrate the continual evolution of settlement into a series of sudden moments of change or crisis that define the beginning and end of each period. So that the interpretation of these figures poses many problems and are affected, so the interpretation is affected by several biases resulting in over or under represented phases, over or under representation of several chronological phases. The difficulties with chronological control strongly depend on different recovery biases, including, for example, survey intensity, visibility, erosion, and other post-depositional processes. Not less important is the diagnosticity of surface material. Survey archaeologists have mostly to rely on ceramic-based figures in order to reconstruct demographic and economic growth and/or stagnation and settlement distribution patterns over time. So here you can see a fine ware-based figure of settlement pattern in the Republican, early Roman, and late Roman time, entirely based on fine ware, not considering at all other classes like regional coarse ware or handmade local wares, because of their very low diagnosticity or dating potential in comparison to very high diagnostic and ubiquitous fine ware classes. So like, for example, African red slip ware. So here we have black glaze ware. This is like the guide fossil for the Republican time. Italian sigillata, the proxy for the imperial period, early and middle imperial, and African red slip ware, the proxy for late Roman period. So using this information, we would think that we have a boom in settlement, demography, and economic growth starting from the late Roman period. Because African red slip ware is a very common and very diagnostic ceramic, which provide a very fine-grained dating in comparison to other classes. Here you have the weighted mean per year, a calibration of the dating, so a method in order to calibrate dating of well-datable ceramic classes like sigillata. And this method consists in dividing the number of the sherds by the number of the years in which each form has been produced, so that we have, for some classes, a very stringent ceramic profile. For other classes, a very low definition. So the problems related to these limits, to the limits of a reliable definition of site contemporaneity, have, of course, dramatic consequences on the whole results of the application and interpretation as well of very popular GIS-based spatial analysis methods, very popular in archaeology. In order to model site patterns, for example, here density figures and distributional patterns, in order to understand spatiality of settlement, like clustered and dispersed settlement patterns, or the definition of theoretical territory and site catchment. Here an example of the application of Thyssen polygons on different site hierarchies, so around towns, around central places like nucleated settlement, villages, and around farms, as well on topography-based, raster-based coast distance analysis from site nodes in the landscape. So these kind of applications rely on the definition of the contemporaneity of settlements. This problem of the reliable definition of sites contemporaneity makes the application very problematic. Before concluding, I would like to shift from the sites-oriented, from the nodes sites-oriented approach to the off-site ceramic survey, mapping the landscape as a continuum and therefore allowing recording minor sites and rural activities like manuring practices, for example, and not only well-preserved structures on the landscape. Methodologically speaking, sites were generally defined by a concentration of finds that has a higher density than the relative minimum required, with the acknowledgement of recovery biases like survey intensity and visibility, post-depositional spreading, and archaeological background noise. Here you have an example of this kind of biases, like survey intensity influences, of course, the number of recovered sites, and visibility is as well a very debated issue in landscape archaeology. In order to consider visibility, I used like a visibility factor on the field. Here you can see the mapping of the number of shards in agricultural fields, modern agricultural fields, and here the visibility factor for each field considered. So we have to consider these biases, and these biases are usually defined statistical inference. So they are under the umbrella of the statistical inference and statistical biases affecting the archaeological sample. So it comprises, for example, collection procedure and the recovery factors, as well as post-depositional processes. Focusing more on archaeological inference, at this stage, rather than on statistical inference, by considering the diversity of the activities generating the different surface assemblages together with depositional and post-depositional processes, and not only statistical biases, allows to exploit the potential and the strengths of the survey, which is to operate at a regional scale and to provide the broader regional context. So archaeological inference, it means we consider first the diversity of the activities generating assemblages and not only statistical biases starting from the same situation in antiquity. So it is an approach which has to be developed, so the attention to the activities generating these surface assemblages. So we can look as an example at the off-site mapping of the ceramic density, visibility corrected density per hectare of the ceramic density in this microregion. So we have, of course, statistical biases and limitations in detecting and interpreting the archaeological evidence, especially concerning small sites, like perishable sites, whose archaeological correlates are low visible artifact scatters. However, considering the African landscape as a palimpsest of diverse activities and sites, allows reflecting also about the space between the dots of the Roman monumental farms, which has been not empty, as revealed, for example, by diverse iconographic sources depicting the so-called Mapalia huts in the African landscape nearby a Roman porticus villa. So we have the possibility to fill the gaps between our sites nodes and to understand in a very different manner the complexity and the diversity of the Roman landscape using more intensive survey methodology and as well mapping methods and calibration methods, considering the archaeological record in connection to past social variability. So thank you very much for your attention.